A few years back, I rented a cabin with my friend Jennifer out in the forest. We were in the mood to spend some time out in nature, but we weren't willing to go all the way and spend time in tents. Because of this, she rented the cabin, and we were set to spend 2 weeks there. The cabin itself was set pretty far out into the woods. There were no other cabins that were really close by to it. We wanted the full experience and felt that being isolated was the best way to get this. There wasn't electricity, so there wasn't a TV or anything like that. There was a propane tank that gave us hot water and allowed us to use the stove. Other than that, it was pretty rustic. For the first week, we had the sort of experience we had been looking to get. We did some hiking, some fishing, saw all sorts of birds and other animals. We actually began to feel really relaxed being far away from any people. At the beginning of the second week, though, we were inside preparing lunch when all of a sudden we heard a knock at the door. Needless to say, we were very surprised. It was the first contact we'd had with a single person since we'd gone. I went to check the door, only to see there was a man standing there, possibly in his mid-30s or so, waiting outside. I asked the man what he needed, and he told me he was the landlord for the cabin. He was there to collect the rent for the week. This was puzzling, because not only had we never seen this guy before, we'd also paid for the cabin in full before we moved in. I told him this, of course, and he said he didn't know what we were talking about. He then told us that if we did not pay him for the week, he would have to call the police and remove us from the cabin forcibly. I got extremely angry at this point and told him to go right ahead. We had the receipts showing we had paid for this cabin in full. The man began to get irate again, starting to yell at me, so I slammed the door right in his face. We watched from the window as the man went out to his Jeep and drove away. I figured he must be some sort of con artist and tried to put it out of my mind. It seemed like a really stupid con, though. That had been around noontime or so, and we hadn't seen or heard from that person again. We figured he'd realized we'd seen through his con, and thusly was not going to try again. Jennifer went to her room and went to bed early. I, though, decided to stay up and do some reading before bed. It was pretty late now. I heard Jennifer scream in the other room. Immediately, I dropped my book, shot up, and ran over to her door. I didn't even have to knock on it, as she threw the door open and grabbed me. A noise woke me up, and that guy from earlier was looking in through my window, Jennifer told me frantically. I rushed into the bedroom and looked out, but the guy was not there any longer. Well, at first I thought so, but then I began to hear a pounding on the front door, a loud, frantic pounding. I ran into the living room and saw the man looking in through the window. He looked extremely pissed. "Give me my damn money!" he began shouting over and over again. I was happy that the door was locked. The man moved away, but just when I thought he had gone, I heard a crashing noise and a rock came flying through one of the living room windows. Glass shattered all over the place. The man then tried to come into the house through the window. He had gotten partway in and was trying to pull the curtains to the side. I was at a complete loss as to what to do. I didn't have a gun or anything like that, which at this point in time made me feel real bad about it. Jennifer, however, had her wits about her. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed a heavy skillet. By the time the intruder got the curtain out of his face, Jennifer slammed him right in the face with the pan. When he fell back, she smacked him again. The second hit knocked him over, and the third hit knocked him out cold. Jennifer panicked again, and for a moment I thought the man hadn't been knocked out yet. She reached down and picked something up off the ground. The man had broken in through our window, holding a meat cleaver in his hand. Who knows what would have happened if Jennifer hadn't acted so swiftly. Have you ever driven through one of those really rural areas and seen those old gray, abandoned, and weather-torn buildings just sitting off the road? Some of them are set in the strangest places, and you wonder why anyone would ever have built a building there. I enjoy exploring those sorts of places due to the way it allows my imagination to think about what the building's history was. You sometimes find these sorts of places out in the middle of forests or fields. In those cases, I tend to assume that they were there first, and the forest eventually grew up around the buildings once they'd been abandoned. A few years back, I was exploring out in the woods, trying to find some new cool places. I was going pretty deep now, possibly trespassing on someone else's property, but I didn't really care much about that. Late in the afternoon, around the time when I should have begun to head back, I came across a particularly dilapidated 2-story building. The building itself was heavily rotting, and it was covered with moss. It even had a tree growing right through the center. I had no idea how long this building could have possibly been here. I had to be extremely careful entering. As far as I knew, anything that looked worn down might have weak floors and might collapse at any moment. Walking up the steps, I definitely heard some loud creaks, but despite my initial worries, the steps held up rather well. It was when I entered through the door that I finally realized what this building must have been. There was a very small foyer that led into the main room, which took up the majority of the bottom floor. I was surprised to discover that this appeared to be a one-room schoolhouse. There were old desks lined up in straight rows, and even a chalkboard on the wall farthest from me. I had never seen a one-room school in person before, so I was very intrigued. I walked through and past the desks to where I saw another door. It must lead to a back room, I assumed, since it wasn't set far enough back to be a back door to the building itself. I opened the door and noticed it seemed to be some sort of office or something. That wasn't what caught my attention though. The floor was absolutely covered in animal bones, and I don't mean just a little bit. There were piles of bones up to my ankles all over the floor. The bones were strung together with string, and some hung from the walls and ceiling. I was freaked out and decided to head back to the main room. As I started to move though, something else caught my attention urgently. The floor had been creaking as I was walking along, but when I stopped, I realized I could hear something else creaking above my head. It was a 2-story building, and it was apparent that something was on the top floor. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but still I felt rather uncomfortable. I thought it might be a good idea to just get the hell out of there. I took my camera out to snap a few pictures before leaving. When I decided to try and get a shot of the lighting fixtures on the ceiling, I turned the camera up, and that's when I saw it. Half of a human face looking down through a little hole in the ceiling. The eyes watching me blinked. I nearly pissed myself and dropped my camera. The face disappeared back into the darkness upstairs. I began to hear rapid creaking sounds as the person upstairs began to randomly walk around. Then I heard them start sprinting toward the staircase. I'd had enough. I found my camera and grabbed it. I decided to get the hell out of there. I ran out, and I didn't look back at all. I ran out of the building and kept going until I was sure that person was not following me. It's weird in a way because I had no way of knowing what the person in that building was or if they were dangerous in any way. But for some reason, hearing them come down the stairs like that was the most frightening experience of my entire life. I didn't even want to see the person themselves. I mean, sure, I was out in the middle of nowhere, searching through an abandoned building. That person was there before me on the exact same day. So I decided it best to just leave them to whatever they were doing. When my dad passed away, one of the many things he left me was his cabin. I hadn't been to it since I was a little kid. Being out in the wilderness was never really my thing. Although it had electricity and even one of those big old satellite dishes, I still always felt it was too far away from civilization to truly enjoy it. It meant a whole lot to my father though, so when I inherited it, I decided not to sell it. I went up to it occasionally, just to maintain it and make sure it was safe and secure still. I never had any intentions of spending significant time there myself, though about 5 years after I took possession of the cabin, I had a really unpleasant experience when I went to do a routine check of the place. When I would do this, I generally drove up for the weekend. It was a very long drive from where I lived, so I would spend the entire weekend there, then head home. This particular time, the weather report proved to be extremely wrong on the way to the cabin. Dark green and black clouds began to overtake the entire sky while I was driving out into the hills. I had a front row seat to an amazing lightning show though. This was going to be one of those really nasty storms. I could tell the minute I arrived at the cabin. I couldn't figure out why, but I immediately had a feeling of nervousness wash over me. I was hoping this was just because of the storm, and not that I was getting a sixth sense about something. The rain began to fall about 5 minutes prior to my arrival. It was pouring down extremely hard by the time I left my car. I hadn't brought an umbrella with me and had to run to the door. I was distressed to realize the door was unlocked. I began to worry right away because of this. It had been about 6 months since the last time I had been there, so I had no way of remembering if I had locked it or not. I was concerned someone may have robbed me in the meantime. I went inside and for the most part, everything looked pretty normal. That was until I went into the kitchen and I got really concerned. The window on the kitchen door was broken and had a garbage bag taped up over it. I certainly hadn't done that. Someone had broken in. I immediately went to the front door and locked it shut. If the person had been staying there though, they didn't seem to be here now. I checked throughout the cabin and made sure all the windows were locked. I would have gone back out to my car and went to the police if the rain weren't coming down as hard as it was. I went throughout the house and checked to see if anything was missing. The bedroom was a bit of a mess. I checked the closet though, and thankfully my dad's shotgun was still right where I'd left it. I really had no experience with guns, but I did know how to load it. I did so and laid it down on the bed. If someone had been living there and was going to be coming back, I needed to be prepared for if they were dangerous. I had been in the cabin for a few hours before nightfall fell. I made sure the lights in the front room were on, so if whoever had been there came back, they would see that somebody was there now. It was really late at night when I saw a pair of headlights shine through the front window and onto the cabin wall. Peeking outside, I saw what I assumed to be a large truck with its high beams on. 2 people got out of the cab, but didn't turn the lights off. I was already worried, but I was even more so when I noticed both of them looked to be carrying rifles with them. They stood in front of the truck for a moment before I saw them begin to walk forward. They stopped at my car and stood on either side. I watched as both of them raised the butt of their rifles and heard the sound of both of my car windows shattering. After that, they shattered the back windows as well, then began moving back toward the house. Of course, I panicked. I had 2 people who were obviously the ones who had broken into my father's cabin, approaching it after breaking the windows out of my car. I ran over and grabbed the shotgun. I wasn't sure what I could do because I wasn't going to open the door for them. That would expose myself right proper, but these guys were going to get up to the cabin door, and who knew what they would do if they got a hold of me. I went and broke the window of the front door. I stuck the barrel of the shotgun out and pulled the trigger. In addition to the loud explosion, I heard one of the guys scream out and fall over. I was concerned I'd blasted him directly. I'd simply wanted to fire a warning shot. The other took his rifle and shot at the house a couple of times. I watched from a vantage point from which neither man could see me. I saw him help the other man to his feet and pull him back to the truck. He tossed the hurt guy into the cab and they drove off. I spent the rest of the night completely on edge, expecting them to return. The interior of my car was completely ruined. I had to clean it out to at least drive into town. I brought the sheriff out and let him look around. I ended up spending a few more days up there, restoring the damage done to my cabin. There wasn't a whole lot more I could do, other than install a security system. I try to go up to it every couple of months now instead of every 6, and each time I do, it's scary as hell. Every time I open that door, I expect one of those guys to be back there. When I was little, I lived in a very safe neighborhood. All the neighbors were either friends or relatives of friends. And this being the late 80s, we were allowed to roam and play however much we wanted, as long as we'd be back home before dinner. The earliest encounter I can remember with this creep was when I was around 6 years old or so. I was with a group of other kids, riding our bikes down the steep hill that led down into our neighborhood. One of the other kids suddenly noticed a man standing against a fence at the top of the hill, not very far away from this parked blue van. I didn't recognize the man, and neither did anyone else around me, but that didn't really mean anything at the time. I had only just been allowed to leave the yard and assumed I didn't know everyone in the area yet. I don't know why, but we all decided to go over to him. My parents had told me to stay with the group, so I just followed along behind. I don't really remember much about the man, only that he seemed to pay an extraordinary amount of attention to me. Even after the other kids had wandered off to continue riding on their bikes, the man kept me staying and talking. I remember very clearly how when he asked my age and I told him, he smiled this big creepy smile and said I looked much older, at least 12 or 13. I guess this was supposed to be a compliment, but I was aware of how much younger I looked and was compared to everyone else. I mean, I didn't even have a bike because I was too small to reach the pedals on my own. I even had pigtails with ribbons in them. I don't know if he creeped me out exactly, but I quickly excused myself and rejoined the group. Honestly, I think I felt more insulted than anything, like he was making fun of me by pointing out I didn't really belong with this group of teenagers. Eventually, I went home though, and I didn't tell my parents about the man. In my mind, he was an adult and I wasn't allowed to question adults at that age. Stranger danger had never really been much of a thing in my family. Skip ahead 3 years now. It was Christmas and I was 9 years old. I'd finally been given my very own bike. And this one was not a little kid's bike either. I was so proud I just had to go out to try it, despite the cold weather. Of course, my parents allowed it right away. I headed out to that hill all alone. It was Christmas and no one was going to come play on Christmas morning. I had spent about 20 minutes rocketing down the hill on my cherry red bicycle. I even wiped out once, skinning my palms, when I started to notice a blue van driving by slowly and repeatedly as well. I didn't remember that previous encounter at this point. I suppose, like for any 6-year-old, something that happened 3 years ago was completely inconsequential at the time, and I'd quickly forgotten about it. This van drove down the road, past the drive into the neighborhood, at least 3 times. I got this very strange feeling, a tingling down my spine, like someone was watching me. I'd never had that feeling before in my life. The only way I can describe it is a visceral, primitive warning that you're now the prey to someone very dangerous. Luckily, I was able to keep my cool though. I kept on riding my bike and watched that same van drive slowly by back and forth at least a dozen times. Finally, when it passed me by for the last time and disappeared behind some trees, I took the opportunity to book it down the hill, using gravity and every bit of strength in my legs to build up enough speed to get me all the way to the end of the drive. I did it so fast I didn't even have to stop. Quite a feat since my house was the very last one. I ditched my brand new bike in the grass and ran inside to safety. Again, I didn't tell my parents though, half because I felt like I was just being silly, and half because my mom was cooking and my dad was watching TV. 2 activities to never be interrupted in my house, on threat of spanking. I never saw that blue van again. I didn't find out until I was 29 exactly how lucky I was that day. After my father's death, I helped my mother clear out his house. While looking through some old boxes, I found an old answering machine, a bunch of tapes, and a tape player as well. Knowing the narcissist my father was, I assumed they must be a combination of old messages from nearly 3 decades ago, and him singing badly and playing the guitar even worse. I took the whole thing home and started to listen to the tapes. mostly for nostalgia. I was half right, but they were not just missed calls from friends and family. I was not in any way prepared for the absolute filth on these old answering machine tapes. I'm not one to blush at bad language. Though I may not use some of the words I heard myself, it didn't really bother me when others did. But this made me physically sick. Maybe because these messages were all directed at me, at a child version of me. Entire hours-long tapes were filled with this one single man calling over and over. They started with some polite-sounding variation of, "This message is for my name. If you could let her know, I'd really appreciate it." Afterwards, nothing but graphic, vulgar descriptions of what he planned to do to me step by step. How he wouldn't hurt me too much. He'd make sure to leave me somewhere my parents could find me when he was done. He didn't say whether he meant alive or not either. He called me his girlfriend and talked about how beautiful I was. There were long tributes to my blonde hair and how he planned to cut it off and keep it after he'd defiled me. He'd wash it off first, of course. He wasn't dirty like that. This was, of course, all in the most filthy language you wouldn't even find in porn. The messages stopped abruptly right around when I was 10 years old, though. After that, it was nothing but the usual missed calls again. I don't know what happened to that man. He really didn't sound like the kind of person to just go and give up. Maybe he ended up dead or in jail, but I do know my dad had a tendency of handling things himself. I know of at least 2 other incidents when someone was bothering my mom or me. They stopped after he went to have a talk with them. Looking back, I suspect that my father was a genuine psychopath in a clinical sense. I destroyed those tapes because I didn't want my mother to find them. If she knew, I have no plans to bring it up now. If she didn't, I don't want her to ever know, for her own peace of mind. Honestly, I kinda wish I hadn't found it either.